Everyone, I want to say a huge welcome to everyone that's coming to listen to the first session of Nation in Conversation for Nambu Cape this year. With Nation in Conversation, we try to have honest discussions. We try to have honest discussions about the agricultural sector and certain issues that the agricultural sector face. And I also would like to welcome our esteemed speakers today. We have a great panel today who's going to actually delve a little bit deeper into the effect of trade relations, especially with the Russian war and the effect that the Russian war might have on trade relations, and also especially on the agricultural sector. Once again, you are welcome. We will also have time for questions after the discussion. You're very welcome to ask your questions to any one of the panelists. We really hope that you enjoy this discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Francois. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody that's online. As Francois said, this is the first discussion, and I have a panel that I think is suited to give us the perspective from different angles. Firstly, just Wandile Shlobo, unfortunately can't make it today. So we appreciate that, and hopefully next time we will have him here. So we're going to talk about trade relations, impact of Russia, AGOA, but let me first introduce my panel members. At the far side is Anthony Clark. Anthony is an esteemed analyst. He's been analyzing JSE companies, food companies specifically, smaller sized company for a number of decades. Anthony, thank you very much, and we're going to specifically want your perspective in the discussion about how does it impact various companies, but also a bit about the capital flows, but we'll get to that. John Hudson from Nedbank. John is always supporting these discussions. John, thank you very much. I'm going to ask John a bit about the importance of things like AGOA, the adaptability of of the South African agriculture sector. John, thank you very much, and thank you for always partaking.
Pleasure.
Then next to him is Wolf Broad. He is from Agbiz. Wolf is going to set the scene for us. Although this is an area that's technical, that is what Wolf flourishes in. And next to me, the Premier of the Western Cape, Mr. Alan Windy. Alan, thank you very much, and thank you for making the time. We also have the Mayor of the local municipality in the audience. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. It is a pleasure for us to be here. It's really nice to drive into a town that you can actually see that the local government is looking after the town. So thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for attending. Wolf, I'm going to start with you. Okay. Let's try to put South Africa a bit into perspective in terms of our trade. We're talking about the trade with the West, the AGOA, the BRICS trade, our international relations. Just give us a bit of perspective.
Thanks, Stuart. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here and be on the panel. We are a very open economy in terms of our trade relations. After the liberalization of the 90s, we de-liberalized significantly. We removed our controls in agriculture. We became an export-focused nation. We now export about over 50% of our products in terms of value terms, agricultural products. And we have a wide range of regions that we export to. Interestingly enough, Africa is still our largest destination. We have about 38% goes into Africa, all agricultural goods. Then followed, we have the Europeans at about 20. We have Asians close behind Africa at about the mid-30s. The Europeans are 19 to 20% of our agri-exports. And then the UK itself is about 5 to 7% of our exports. So we find that the African continent is still our largest single opportunity, and then followed by Asia, then followed by the EU and the UK. And we find that, and then there's the rest of the world, which includes the Americans, funny enough. So interestingly enough, the Americans are a smaller percentage, quite a small percentage of our trade in terms of agricultural exports currently. But it's important to note that we have opportunities that we are only just starting to really explore with the Americans. For example, we have the AGOA access, but we don't have a national strategy for AGOA yet. Out of the 35 beneficiaries, you have about 19 that have national action plans for accessing AGOA. And it's something that on our side as AGBIS, we've asked government if there's something we could work on together to maximize that penetration of the market there. And then, of course, in terms of trade arrangements, the bulk of our trade arrangements are with our traditional partners. So we have Europe, we have Africa, and we have the unilateral one the Americans give us access. It's not actually a free trade agreement. We are reliant on them to grant us that space. But in Asia, we have yet to strike any deals. We have the, what I like to call sometimes the zombie trade agreement with India, because it's been alive and dead since the mid-2000s. It's apparently going to come alive now. We have hopes after the BRICS summit that, as summits do, they breathe enthusiasm into things and bring them to life or unblock things. So I expect we will see action on the SACU-India trade deal, hopefully, and that could be very beneficial for agriculture. But as you would know, BRICS itself is not going to generate a trade agreement at present. What we have is an opportunity, we have a space, we have a market, and we have now deeper relationships and friendships. And we can leverage those bilaterally to unblock things and to remove impediments and get into those markets in a way that non-BRICS countries can't do. But like I said, if we're to place them in perspective, the Asian market is second only to Africa in terms of our focus, then come the Europeans, and then only then the English, and then down to the Americans. So there's potential in the US, but at the moment it's still a very small base that we're growing from, which is very interesting considering the amount of noise around AGOA. But admittedly, as soon as you step outside of agriculture, and our colleagues will speak to that, we see the massive importance. Although for us, we have the potential for avos and citrus, for example, in America, that is fantastic. If we can get in there, I mean, just for us with our size of our agri sector, just to have that opportunity for volume and jobs, it's remarkable. It's still a massive market.
Alan, I'm going to turn to you and give it a slight more of a political dimension to it. And I'm going to use India as an example. How does India get it right for Mr. Modi to invite it to the White House, to struck transactions on the technology sector, which are very sensitive, to have the discussions where both President Biden and Prime Minister Modi expresses their close relationship? On the other side of the world, India imports oil, cheap oil from Russia, and they exclude the dollar exchange rate. It's a bilateral agreement, as well as giving humanitarian support to the Ukraine. How do they get it right to play in all these fields, and we seem to struggle with this? Your view on that?
So I think, first of all, I mean, they're obviously a big player in the world market. That has, well, there's a big difference between us and them. But I also think it's about what they communicate, how they say it, and you've got to build trust. So, for example, South Africa will say one thing at the UN. South Africa will say that we want to remain neutral in this Russia-Ukraine war, but then we don't show that we're neutral. So we'll say it at one platform and then come back home and we'll have ships in our harbors, our military harbors, or we'll play war games, etc. And so, you know, it would have been way better for us to say up front, a UN position, we've got a long-term political relationship with Russia, and therefore we're going to take this position, but we're going to hold that position. And then what happens is you build trust. But as soon as you break that, you don't build trust. And of course, we're a much smaller economy, and then so it becomes much easier to play with South Africa as a football in this game. And yeah, so and that's what concerns me. You know, we need to be quite clear in our political positioning, and I'm trying to do that now in the Western Cape. You're going to speak about AGOA just now. Exactly was my position on AGOA. It's important for us as a province, and I understand the trade part. But it's about the bigger picture. It's about tourism, it's about trade, and it's about foreign direct investment. And when you add all of those three together, the US is an important player. The EU is an important player. And if you look at the total exports of South Africa, 1.8 trillion, and you know, that market of EU and the US is like 30%, where the Russian market is 0.2%. So it's insignificant in the big picture. And so, therefore, we've got to be very careful the positions we take, the political positions we take as a country on those platforms like...
But is politicians or governments are not necessarily known for being able to weigh the political consequences and the economic consequences.
Well, they should.
But you agree that there's kind of it's if you purely were to look at the economic position, it would be different than a pure political position. But we don't get that right.
No, but you see, that is where the problem lies. And your initial question was around India. And of course, any country wants to do what it does in the best interests of its citizens. Well, one would hope that that's why you're doing it. You're doing it in the best interests of your citizens. You're doing it in the best interests of growing your markets, of building a better society. And so, I think that's the predicament that South Africa finds itself in, is we're not able to do that. And that's the great frustration. Because, I mean, if you just straight up front, you say it like it is, and you behave in that manner, then you'll build trust with whichever market, and it doesn't matter whether it's East or West.
So what we're agreeing on is that we should trade with all the parties.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we should fit our diplomatic and political position so that that's where we end up.
Well, I want to say another thing about South Africa, which really frustrates me. We should have our strongest ambassadors in our economic centers, but we don't do that.
Okay.
We put our weakest ambassadors in those markets. And that's a big problem for me. And for example, on the AGOA question, I mean, I was on a plane, I was in Washington, I was meeting the committees that drew up the legislation. Because remember, as was said earlier, this is not a trade agreement. This is a piece of legislation that gives us some opportunity. We must use that opportunity to the maximum, and we don't. There's a lot of sectors that could actually be maximizing into that space. And of course, it has other knock-on effects. So, for example, the US and our program on fighting HIV and AIDS and tuberculosis, in the last 20 years, they've put $100 million into our region in a health space, which we desperately need. So we can't cut that off. They're the biggest foreign direct investor into our region. And foreign direct investment has like a first wave, and then it has extra waves that come. So, for example, on the back of perhaps, say, citrus, which is growing nicely into the US on the back of AGOA, you start to build those relationships, and then the counter investments start to come, and you could even get production, extra production or agri-processing systems
around that,
because there's got a market developing.
Anthony, your forte is analyzing companies. This discussion about AGOA, and if we turn it into specific companies, how do you read that? What will be the impact on various companies that you focus on?
Thanks, Theo. It's nice to be on this side of the panel for a change. The Premier makes a great point regarding exports. AGOA as a total package is actually quite small. It's about 180 billion rand. And of that, of the nearly 3,300 companies that benefit from that agreement, basically 23 companies make up 75% of all the benefits, of which 5 companies... 23 companies out of 3,500 benefit mostly from AGOA. And of the balance, 5 make up 50% of all the AGOA benefits, mainly in the motor industry, of which the largest participant is Mercedes-Benz. Now, many of these companies internationally are listed on foreign exchanges. Locally, we as South Africans have a huge beneficiation industry, where OEMs manufacture parts that go into the likes of Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Ford, etc., which are exported. So whilst that is a very important sector, and we're here discussing AGOA and agriculture, agriculture in the greater scheme of things is actually quite small. I was looking through the list last week of the key AGOA beneficiaries. Automotive is number 1, unsurprisingly. Number 2 is chemicals. Number 3, which might surprise many in the audience, is jewelry. And then the list starts dropping quite rapidly. But it's only a handful of companies that actually benefit, mainly internationals, who have spent a great deal of money over the years investing in large manufacturing plants in Pretoria, in Newton Hague, etc., to manufacture cars. So it's a spin-off benefits that flow through into our economy from having those internationals in this country. Now, if for whatever reason the Americans suddenly change their favor towards us, The implications could be that those international companies may not wish to invest further into expanding their production. That then has a ripple effect to companies, for example, like Meta Investments, which is one of the largest manufacturers in this country of parts going into the automotive sector. And they say for every one direct job in the export sector, there are dozens in the ripple effect, supplying everything from cups of coffee to the canteens, all the way up to the value chain. So there's a huge spin-off in the listed space. If we talk about the industrial side, there is a plethora of companies that will be directly impacted, particularly on the motor side, if AGOA were to be disrupted. But we're here discussing mainly agriculture. It is NAMPO, as a matter of course. And agriculture is actually quite small. There is significant potential, as we've discussed, in citrus and in other fruits, table grapes amongst others. But again, locally, and I'll give you some direct examples. My colleagues here will discuss the fruit industry. I specifically cover the poultry sector as well, because there aren't many direct listed fruit companies. There used to be Cape Span, they're now privately owned, part of Zeta Investments. Astral Foods is the company's largest chicken producer. The second largest is RCL, the old Rainbow Chickens. And they have, interestingly, a direct interest in AGOA, but not for the reason that you think. Because imports into this country, particularly in the poultry sector, have been quite aggressive over a number of years. And as my colleagues know here, there's been significant tariffs placed on imports from Brazil, European Union, Argentina, etc., with the latest round that Minister Patel has just implemented. AGOA allows the Americans to import just under 72,000 tons a year of product tariff-free. Now, those are the highly contentious products which the poultry industry really gets in a flap about, which is leg quarters. And perversely, I've written that if AGOA were to be withdrawn, some in the poultry industry would have cartwheels that the American product would not be coming into this country. But the flip side is there'd be a huge swathe of this economy which would be negatively impacted, even though one small sector, which has a very loud squawk in the agricultural sector, would benefit. So I think we have to balance going forward very carefully the narrative coming out of this government about some areas we would benefit, like we wouldn't get as much imports of poultry coming in, but we would lose so much in terms of export trade, and particularly in job creation, particularly in the fruit sector. And I think government, in its alignment with our communist partners in the north, sometimes fails to understand that in the bigger picture, it's the workers on the ground that will suffer. I was doing some work yesterday. Currently, there are 30,000 employees involved in the greater citrus industry in the Eastern and Western Cape. They exported 115,000 tons in 2022, generating about 15 billion rand in revenue. Now, that industry is projected to grow by 2030 to 260 million tons of citrus. We'll probably be the largest exporter in the world. That could create an extra 70,000 jobs. If AGOA were to suddenly be lost, all of those jobs in the rural heartland, particularly in our province, would get hit. And I actually don't think that our friends in Pretoria actually care what's going on with their messaging, as President Winde said. So all in all, on the listed side, there would be some beneficiaries if AGOA were to suddenly fall away. But in the greater scale of trade in this country, it would be insignificant to the destruction of value, and particularly the loss in economic benefit and, more importantly, labor.
So we need to be careful to look at the numbers and say it's a small percentage. There's a massive compounding effect on that. You wanted to say something?
I was just going to add to it. So when we went to the US, before we went, we called all the agri-sectors together to say, let's just hear from each one of you. And what we built into the model was, what is the impact of no AGOA in America? And it was interesting. So the 30,000 citrus jobs here, the value chain in the States is another 20,000 jobs.
That goes into that side of
American jobs. In the ports, in the retail space,
that might have an impact.
etc., that would have an impact. So that was quite interesting because we could at least put that on the table. Then they were going, hang on a second. It's very easy for Senator Coons to say, well, let's get rid of this. Although
There's another side of that coin.
yeah, there's another side of the coin.
John?
And we specifically said, but it's in the senator's constituency that harbour sits, you know. We
John,
have to be clever there too.
from your point of view, Nedbank is a financier in the agriculture sector, obviously a financier in the rest of the economy as well. How do you read these discussions? And I want to again emphasize coming back to AGOA as the trade agreement and AGOA from an economic perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Theo. I think it's been well positioned, and we're having some good discussion here. And what it does show that this is a very complex issue, and that there's a number of spin-offs and implications. But certainly, I think there's no doubt that it is important. It's been discussed, and the reasons why it's important, not necessarily just the trade itself, but the market opportunity. I think Anthony mentioned, citrus growth is going from 160 million cartons this year, we're going to end up around about there, to 260 million cartons of citrus by 2030. Now, if you think about it, 95, 98, 99% of our value in citrus is exported. So there's very little local consumption.
Simply the local market cannot take up what we are producing, and that is a fact.
It's not going to take it up. And just to add to that 50% that Wolf mentioned, that by value more than 50% of our trade, of our production is now exported. You can see where this is going. Yeah. We have to drive exports. And we have to we have to nurture the existing markets, but find new markets as well. So this is absolutely critical. And while it's a very, the America, in particular the USA, is a very small percentage. I think it's less than 4% of the sort of agricultural. And last year we exported $12.8 billion US. It was a record, three record years in a row. This year we're not sure if we're going to hit that 12.8, but we're going to get close. The point I'm making is that we can't afford to lose any markets. Okay. The second point is that losing the status is, yes, it just increases the cost of doing business, but you still have access to that market, all right? If you take it a step further, and I'm not saying that this is going to take place, but if you go to full-blown sanctions, and I think Wolf made the mention, if you look at America and you add EU and you add UK, now you're looking at a big basket, and that's where it becomes scary, because full-blown sanctions would have a massive impact. But it would be, I suppose, not right for me to say that that's the route we're going, but we just need to keep that in mind. The last point I do want to make on this is, I think the financial implication is I wouldn't say it's misunderstood, but it needs to be better understood. And this is just the wider implication in the financial markets. And if I take us back to the start of the year when we had the grey listing, so there's something called the CDS spread, which essentially measures the risk premium of a country. And at the beginning of the year, we were about 130, okay? And the grey listing came and it bumped up a bit, 150 odd. Then the load shedding kicked in really severely, and it went up to about, I think, 170 odd. Then we had the diplomatic spat with the USA, and it jumped to 200, okay? So you've gone from 130 to 200, your risk premium. And therefore, your cost of servicing debt, there's all those implications that we probably don't always understand. So when we position ourselves, and I think Alan mentioned it very clearly, that the positioning is critical, because that's what drives this negative sentiment. And if your risk premium rises, then people want a greater return. So you're going to pay more for your debt,
And people need to be compensated for that. If you turn that risk premium around and you statistically try to calculate an implied chance of South Africa defaulting, we are now just more than 5%, 5.2 to 5.3%. If you were to say it purely on the odds, what's the chance with that rating of defaulting? And that starts to become an issue because of this. But I want to ask you another, I want to get to another angle, Anthony. AGOA feels almost like we a 18-year-old playing in the under-13 team. Do we actually qualify for AGOA? Because AGOA is there for the poorest of the poor countries. Do we actually qualify, or are we playing are we using the benefit, but we actually don't qualify to play in that game?
That's a great and very emotive question. When AGOA was created decades ago, back then this economy was going through much more difficult times than we are now. And I suppose, given that we are part of BRICS, and and seen as, I would say, we are a developed market. Yes, we have our challenges of load shedding and economic incompetence, amongst other things. But at the end of the day, we as an economy actually do need the assistance of major Western trading partners to actually uplift many sections of the society which have still been left behind decades after the fall of apartheid. And one area that can assist, of course, is exports, particularly in the agricultural sector, because of the number of jobs that can be directly created, particularly in the rural areas, which have been left behind, perhaps in the growth of urbanization in this country. So I suppose in a purely economic sense, you would say that South Africa shouldn't really be in AGOA. There are many other countries in Africa which are going through stages of early development. You could say the same thing. Should Nigeria, for example, have certain benefits, given it's a large oil exporter? The same with Egypt. But at the end of the day, getting any benefit into a major Western market in terms of the saving of tariffs, which could perhaps create additional employment and economic activity in this country, which we woefully need, given the state of the unemployed and the terrible suffering that goes on in certain parts of this economy. We need all the help we can get. So I would guess on a purely economic basis, I should say we shouldn't be. But on a moral and ethical basis, we absolutely have to be, because we need every help we can get to try and uplift many sections of this community to actually create a meaningful life for themselves. And that's what AGOA actually does, if we don't mess it up.
Okay, can I add to that? I think that, and I agree absolutely with that answer, but also remember that we've got the highest youth unemployment, or one of the highest in the world, and we've got massive unemployment. And I think your earlier answer to the question was that we've only got a few companies that are making use of AGOA, and that's actually our Achilles heel, because those companies, you almost could say, well, they shouldn't be getting that advantage. And the other companies who should be are not there yet. And I mean, I'm looking at the head of agriculture sits over there, and we've got to make sure that we enable those smaller companies who should be the ones where we're going to see the employment coming through. They need to find access. And I mean, that we must look back at ourselves as government and say, how can we help to enable those companies? Because then it becomes much more worthwhile. And I think it will be seen in the eyes of those lawmakers as well. Have a look at the difference that our piece of legislation is making to an individual on the African continent here in Southern Africa.
Yeah, I agree, Premier. That's why, from our perspective, it's puzzling that we don't actually have a national AGOA strategy, because our neighbors do. Mozambique, Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, Swaziland, another 15 odd AGOA beneficiaries have these strategies. And it's admittedly worked out with the Americans. You plan a route to expansion of your penetration in the market. So it's a logical thing to do. We just haven't done it. We have queried this as AGBAs in our engagements, but haven't been able to find a clear response to that. So we've put it down on the table saying, look, when it is renewed, we would like to see this put forward. And I think, speaking to the other points made, we have no fallback on AGOA. There used to be this, or there should be, a generalized system of preferences, GSP, a US program for least developed countries, and it includes quite a few countries. It includes us as well. It's a different basket of products, a much wider basket of products. AGOA offers more preference, but that hasn't been reauthorized since 2020. There's parties in Congress trying to push for it, but it's not active at the moment. So if we are booted from AGOA, we have no fallback. And technically, if the Americans wanted to boot us from AGOA, once GSP is authorized, they can pull us out of GSP, and that collapses AGOA. So there's also that. But in terms of per capita income, we actually technically don't, I believe, breach the threshold yet for AGOA to be graduated. But in terms of other variables, we could be eliminated. But coming to the point of the expansion, thank you very much, of the citrus, it's a very good example for the fruit sector and also agriculture. We're blessed with a sector in the economy that really is a national asset. If you woke up tomorrow and you read in the newspapers that manufacturing was going to grow over the next 10 years by 20%, you'd be like, that's fantastic, or financial services sector. And yet that's a routine stat for us in the
agriculture sector.
Yeah. And as you correctly pointed out, 90% of citrus goes out of the country. That's most of our fruits are exported, for example. And we have bumper crops on maize and etc. Now, we need those markets. So for that expansion, and if you look at Citrus' expansion plan from where they are now to where they want to be in 2030 and the other fruit sectors, key to that is expansion into new markets, maximizing traditional markets. For us, it's not a zero-sum game. We don't say we're doing away with traditional markets going into Asia.
We need all the markets.
All the markets, but we really need them because we have the actual potential to grow as a sector, and that's not even really fully factoring in the state land that's going to be released and brought into productive use. I mean, it's amazing. You don't often get this in an economy where you can say this is going to just blow up. So we need the markets, both new and old, and we have to be very clever with this. And the multiplier effect and the trade balance effect is incredible. Agriculture has run a positive trade balance, and I'll end there, over the last decade. I mean, we add to the fiscus in a way that no other sector of the economy has consistently.
So the position that's sometimes criticized, that we try to deal with everybody and try to get whatever the wording is that's being used, that is actually the strategy we should be implementing.
Yeah, we should be seeing ourselves as a friend to all, really. And this is where I believe the comments about where your national interest and what is national interest, where your economic and your political priorities align, is very important. Because, for example, BRICS imports about 371 billion. We export about just under 1 billion to them. These are agricultural figures. So the stats, I mean, the potential is enormous for us. Huge, huge, huge. But at the same time, it's not guaranteed. It takes like 5 to 10 to 12 years to negotiate a free trade agreement. Even if you get that, you must have your phytosanitary protocols in place.
So it's more complicated.
Yeah.
Anthony, I want to touch on the other element of this. We talk about agriculture, but what, in your view, could be the ramification, the broader ramification on our financial markets? Should we slip out of AGOA?
Again, that's a terribly loaded question. You know, if the worst comes to the worst and the American government says, that's it, goodbye. You know, having worked in financial markets now for nearly 40 years, and as my colleague from Nedbank would, I'm sure, agree, it's all about sentiment.
Sentiment.
This country, or this government, has to borrow 2.1 billion rand a day to finance its debt. The more debt this country racks
Just
up...
come back to it. What is that amount?
2.1 billion rand a day.
Every single day?
Every single day.
Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday?
7 days a week, 365 days a year. That has huge implications with interest rates having risen so sharply in the last few years regarding servicing costs on that debt, which means the pie of money the government actually collects from all taxpayers in whatever formats, VAT, personal tax, corporate tax, etc., that pot can only go so far. If a bigger slice of that pie is going to service debt, there's less money left over for healthcare, defense, education,
VIP
services.
protection.
Yeah, yes. And that then has significant implications, again, on the wider economy. You know, right now, we've seen, post-COVID, most global debt rise sharply as economies globally have pumped money into the system to keep countries ticking over because of COVID. We're now at fairly untenable levels of debt globally. Certain economies have the ability to trade themselves out of that because they have natural GDP growth, like in America, Europe, the Far East, etc. We in this country have no growth. Nothing is happening. We're in paralysis, and we're currently in an economic cycle which is tied into an election next year, which will cause further paralysis for another 12 months. Which means that decision makers are sitting on their hands with money to burn, to potentially invest in this country, with an inability to actually make any decisions because nobody knows who's going to be in charge come May next year.
And then you add AGOA to that.
Correct. And then you then start saying, well, do I really want to invest my hard-earned dollars, euros, yen, or whatever, into this country to finance an economy where there's political uncertainty and where there is perhaps indifference to being part of the global trade community? You know, the comments that the ruling party has made has been very clearly disseminated internationally, particularly in the press, as we are not very friendly towards Western economies. Now, ideologically, that may be the tone the ANC wants to play. But let's not forget, there are 65 million people in this country who rely on the politicians in this country for a living and social grants and some form of hope in terms of employment or a future for their families. And currently we're not getting that. So the ramifications of AGOA falling away is not just, oh, we've lost 180 billion rand. We won't lose it. all we will lose is between 1.6 and 2.6 billion rand of tariffs, which we save currently, which in the greater scheme of things is insignificant. We will just pay for tariffs and we can still have access to those markets. But the political, or should I say, the financial shock of us being booted out by the Americans, I think will ripple far and wide. And that's, I think, is the bigger picture.
And the impact of that will be in a boardroom of a motor manufacturer in Japan or in Germany, the decision might just not go our way to invest the additional capital.
Absolutely.
But the knock-on effect, so when the Lady R was in Simonstown Harbour, the rand dollar, I mean, the rand just tanked.
And that was all about sentiment.
Correct.
And then what happens is our short-term bonds, government bonds are generally something that gets taken up quite easily. Short-term bonds since then have not been taken up. Now our debt cost, that 2 billion goes to 1.1 billion, and so it just keeps on growing because it just costs so much more to find money in the system. And then you add load shedding. And when you add load shedding and no growth, then what happens is we can't fund those social grants next year, and we can't fund expansions as government next year. And now suddenly we're in deep trouble, and so the president has to call these special meetings with the Treasury, because what are we going to do going into the election?
Where's the fund money going to...
Exactly.
What for me, just put that, John, I'm going to come to you. I just want to, this whole issue, just to make it as simple for everybody. We borrow 2.3 billion per day.
2.1.
2.1 billion per day. Next week we might talk about 2.1. The problem is that if you look at our inflation rate at 4.7%, 10-year bonds is just shy of 10.5%. That's the real return. So the government need to pay a premium on the inflation rate of close to 6% in order to attract people to lend it money. That means the cost of that is massive. It's not 1 or 2% real. It is actually more than double what we need to pay to have access to that. And that needs to get paid back. John?
Yeah. So one point I did want to make, and it's, I don't want to sort of divert the conversation, but within agriculture and the growing production, etc., logistics chains are absolutely key. So now we're talking about export markets, and I fully agree with that. But we need to get it to port.
You need to get something to harbour.
Yeah. And that's what does concern me, because all these constraints are putting pressure on us investing in infrastructure.
Yeah.
So whether it's road, rail, port, or whatever. And that, unfortunately, is actually increasing the cost of doing business. So if farmers are battling and the cost of doing business is increasing, well, you're not that competitive. You're losing your competitive nature, which is not good. I think South Africa, one of the reasons we have done so well, Wolf, over the last sort of 10 years in terms of economic growth in the sector, is that South Africa does not have much support, but we have had to box clever. We've had to be resilient, we've had to be adaptive, we've had to do a lot of things which have allowed us to grow and find new markets. So we've done exceptionally well, and I think that's actually a strength. But there comes a point where there's certain things are outside of the farmer's control, which is some of this investment into infrastructure, etc., and into the value chain. So that to me is critical. It's part of the bigger discussion, and I don't want to derail this discussion, but we just need to keep that in mind.
I want to come back to that. Can I just, for this discussion, do we agree, therefore, that the South African government needs to find the trust of the international community, or the ability, or a way of being everybody's friend? And we need to be able to trade with BRICS countries, and we need to be able to trade with our neighboring countries, and we need to be able to trade with America. And that is, so this curse of an ideological history is kind of what is hamstringing us.
I fully agree with you. And the easiest way to get out of it is to say that the South African political history with Russia was with the USSR. Russia's a very different place today, and it shouldn't be difficult to take a position on it. But at the same time, I absolutely agree. We really try that from the province's point of view. I mean, I was immediately in the US to protect AGOA in any way that we could. And next week I'm off to China, because we've got to gain back the losses that we've lost in our wine exports to China because of the extended lockdown period during the pandemic. It's a key market for us, even as the Western Cape. We've got a lot of potential to grow into that market as well.
A bit of a question around that. The fact that as a premier of the Western Cape, who is not a member of the governing party, enters into these discussions, what is the relationship between you and the department, or let's say the trade and industry department around this?
So before I went to the US, I've got a very strong position on what my feelings are. I still make a phone call to Ibrahim Patel and say, I'm leaving tomorrow for the US, I'm going on AGOA, this is what I'm doing. While Ibrahim and Enoch and Naledi were in the US a few weeks later, I was getting messages out of the US to say, Senator Coons wants to meet you and you're not answering your email. I sent a WhatsApp, answer the email. You know, I've got to get it going. It doesn't matter. I've got to do whatever I need to do to make sure that we retain our economic position. And for the Western Cape, it is hugely important. And East-West doesn't matter. It's really important. And my job is to see how we can, within the Constitution, which says that I do have our share in trade. We don't necessarily enter into trade agreements as provinces, but we have a responsibility when it comes to trade. Whether it's dealing with the port, and I know we don't want to derail this discussion, although it's a very important discussion. I mean, Transnet's failures, we're spending over 2 billion a day on debt servicing costs, but Transnet failures cost us another billion a day. And if we've got 20% increase in citrus, or in actual fact, this year, this season, we should have about a 20% increase on last year's productivity and export potential. And what is the blockage going to be? The harbour.
Interesting that you note that Stellenbosch University actually issued a report on that, and it came to 1 billion rand a day.
Correct.
That Transnet malfunction cost. If you look at all the elements from exports of commodities that's not getting there, from developments, from the extra cost, it is 1 billion rand a day that Transnet costs us. We are nearly finished with the formal part, and then we'll ask some questions. So I'm going to ask every one of you just a bit, if you were to take 2 or 3 steps back. We in the agriculture community, we in the agriculture sector, where does, Anthony, I'm going to start with you. If you look at the companies in the agriculture sector, and if you look at the challenges, amongst others, these uncertainty, your view on the listed companies where information is available, how resilient are those?
Interestingly, given the trials and tribulations this country has been through over 50 years during the apartheid era and in the democratic era, I think business people in this country are possibly the most resilient of any business grouping in the world. We have to adapt to ever-changing circumstances, both politically and economically, and in the last few years with load shedding. I was with a major food company yesterday with significant exports, and they were lauding the fact that the president was actually in Saudi Arabia earlier this year, which could potentially open up that market to exports from this country of beef, chicken, and varying prepared foods. But there were delays in the bureaucracy in this country. And the single biggest aspect that's curtailing their business right now is load shedding. This 2.6 billion rand listed company turns over 10 billion rand a year, was spending 100 million rand a year in diesel to run its generators just to keep the products going. Then they had to spend additional capex on solar and other power generating equipment, which would have gone into expanding manufacturing capacity and creating jobs.
And now it can't.
Now it can't. And that's just one example. Another example I mentioned earlier, Astral Foods, the country's largest chicken company. They spent 760 million rand last year on diesel.
And that goes straight out?
Straight out. Well, it goes straight up the chimney, apart from the government kickback. Yeah. And that's the money they would have spent, probably expanding their production, creating more jobs, etc., etc. The ripple effect through the listed food producer space is, I would guess, running into the tens of billions in terms of physical cost and, more importantly, lost opportunity. And that needs to be addressed. And I think what is happening here in the Western Cape regarding our desire to try and become independent of the greater electricity problem in this country probably will attract more companies into this province because they know we'll be load shedding free, or at least a little bit load shedding protected, which I think is personally a good thing. There are significant opportunities in exports, particularly in food producers, not just in agriculture.
John, your view from a South African economy, Nedbank is a funder into the sector. Obviously, risk is paramount to any decision to fund agriculture. Your view specifically around what Anthony's saying, the government's responsibility, but also the fact that the sector is based on exporting. What's your view?
Yeah, I'd say if I do look at citrus, for example, and while they had a good run in 2018, 2019 or so, 2022 was an exceptionally tough year for citrus. The freight costs doubled on 21, okay? And that decimated profitability in the citrus sector. So unfortunately what that means is that when the load shedding kicks in, as what Anthony has said, that extra cost is now really squeezing them to the bone, because you need to come through that. They approach their banker and they say, well, I've incurred losses because of very valid reasons outside of our control. But we see 23 as a recovery year. However, we're getting these issues, load shedding and so on. So there's definitely a high level of uncertainty and also risk. Elevated risk in the sector is a concern, and it needs to be managed. I think the farmers, and I did mention it earlier, I think have done exceptionally well over the years, and you mentioned general business for that matter, to stay in the game and in fact be extremely competitive. So that's a big tick. But there's certain things outside of their control. And that's where we need, I guess, private and government to come together to make sure that we're acting in the best interest of the country. I do see much more private sector interest into sort of infrastructure, and I see that as a good move. But we're at a delicate point where I do think there's a realization that we have to do things better, and private and government need to come together. And that's my hope going forward, is that we can start to achieve that. It is, I think Alan mentioned, sometimes the actions and the speak don't always add up. And that's critical going forward, because we can't afford, we're so close to the bone, we can't afford to be derailed by negative sentiment. We really need to work together. But I think it's possible, on the back of what Wolf said, a sector which is really resilient and it's been expanding, you know.
And even if you look at the number of people that the sector employs,
yes,
it is one of the few sectors that seems to be able to take up relatively unskilled labor over periods of time and upskilling that.
Yeah, for sure, because, and you've got the primary and the secondary sector.
Yeah.
So, I think it's well known that the primary contribution to GDP is 2.5%. But if you look at the backward and forward linkages, it is so vitally important, and the rural contribution.
And you add to that food security. Once the sector starts to become into trouble, there's a whole new social element that comes into play.
Yeah, food security is that's a massive conversation on its own. But certainly from a national point of view, yes, we're food secure. From a household food security, not so much. So there's a lot of work to be done. But this is all comes back to having a healthy, competitive and vibrant sort of agricultural sector, which is critical.
Wolf, your view, and I want to take on a point that you said earlier. The massive opportunities in areas where we it seems that we struggle to get trade agreements in place. What's your view on that?
Yeah, okay, let me just quickly start by saying, when it comes to the logistics and the load shedding, I fully agree. I define those as our self-imposed non-tariff barriers. They, ironically, are our own barriers to trade. From our experience, we have found that partnership, speaking to the other point, with government has worked very effectively with us. We've found consistent value and support and a demand for partnership on government side, and we found a whole cadre of people in the various departments we engage with that are competent and willing to engage, and we can't do government's work, they can't do ours. And I feel what I'm missing is a more technocratic approach to our policy making. But we found that we say to government, look, we'll support you to do your job. You take the limelight for this, and then coming to your point, what we need, though, is focus. we need to take this more technocratic approach to focus. And that's where business excels. That's where business has to excel because you survive or fall on your shareholders, your profits, etc., even the SMMEs. And we need to say to government, this is how we think. Now, you tell us how you think. Because I found over the years as working in policy that you're almost a translator. You translate government speak to business, business speak to government. And the same with Labour speak to in the triangle. And it's not that there is a deliberate attempt to be difficult. The parties literally just have different language, mandates, objectives, and goals, and they literally cannot sometimes see each other. And you need to say, this is what we literally need, and what do you literally need, but this is our red lines. Business needs to say these are our red lines, or we go bang, and without us there is no tax base. And looking at that tiny percentage of tax base, I think it was, it's a fraction. You know.
Just have we progressed on that? You've been involved in this for a number of years. Is it getting better or not?
I would say that in terms of our trade agreements and our approach to partnership on that, yes, we have good have had good collaboration, but it's patchy. Our problem is we patchy on things. We're inconsistent in policy. We're remarkable and incredible, and then we freeze, and then we just die, and then we come back to life and we're remarkable and incredible. And our competitors are not like that. The Malaysians, the Thais, the Taiwanese. They seem to have consistency.
So there's a consistency problem with the focus.
Yeah, but I feel that recently there is perhaps, unfortunately, a type of despondency that has crept into both sectors, business and government, and I think it is something that we have to break. And I think that some of our engagements this year on national level, on NLCC, NECOM, etc., are very healthy, because what we've done is we've broken that fear of a deeper partnership. And business has broken, in a sense, its fear of engaging at another level, and government has perhaps broken its fear of what happens if we talk to them. Because that divide, historically, I went to work with sugar sector for a season. I was out of Pretoria for a decade. I came back and I was like, really? It's still like this? It's the historical divide. And we conquer that thing, we will make it.
Alan, this, I know some people talk about it as the trust deficit. Both parties need to be involved. You are from the politics side, and we've got business, we've got Labour, and we've got government. And I'm specifically positioning it as that because you are not part of the governing party. But if we identify that the government's position should be to trade with everybody, not to be boxed into a corner, how do you see the role of politics, government, business, Labour in this idea of the trust deficit that needs to be bridged? Where do you see that?
So I think obviously post-94, there was almost a mistrust between government and business. And
during the Zuma era, that actually was
absolutely worse. But what happened is you started to get it was dividing. Now, if you go look at the most competitive countries in the world, you'll see that nexus is, it's amazing. And of course, you've got to have push and pull in that nexus. But it works. And ours is just separated over time. And that is the big problem. In this crisis, it's interesting because now that's when business comes up and government says, okay, well, let's start talking because we have to. And, hopefully this is a crisis, this energy crisis is a crisis that's sufficient enough to actually say, well, it doesn't matter who the government is, but government and business need to start, or that government, business, Labour needs to start to get a better understanding of each other and work better with each other. Because, in the last 30 years, it just has not.
And unfortunately, the era of state capture was absolutely devastating for the whole economy.
Correct, absolutely. But I also just wanted to say one other thing. We spoke about 2 billion a day in debt servicing costs. We spoke about 1 billion a day that Transnet is costing us. Well, load shedding is just short of 1 billion a day as well. And you add all of those together, that's the problem.
So that's our self-imposed tariffs.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me. We've done the formal side of the discussion. I want to go to questions, and then I'm going to ask everybody for closing remarks. Any questions from the audience? Anybody with a question? Yes, Francois.
Premier Windy, we mentioned load shedding And we also know that the Western Cape is actually trying to solve load shedding issues, or maybe at least reduce the effect of it. What would you say regarding the Western Cape's, how do they approach it, and what's the solution that you propose from your province's side?
Thank you for daai vraag. I see that you've actually got one tomorrow, a session on specific energy, but I don't want to reduce it, I want to solve it. And I think we've got a plan for solution. We use 4,000 megawatts a day peaking, that's our maximum use.
In the Western Cape?
We peak at 4,000 megawatts at the moment. So our plan that is put in place now is for 5,700 megawatts. In other words, you've got current usage plus economic growth built in. That's going to be 10 years worth of. It might come sooner because I mean you can see the pickup starting to come. But it's put 100 megawatts in place. You think, oh well, that's quite easy. It's not that easy. The city's just closed a deal now, 1.2 billion rand deal for 100 megawatts. It's going to take 2 years. That's the problem. That we've got a 200 megawatt tender that's closed. It hasn't been adjudicated and finalized yet. There's a 500 megawatt tender open at the moment. It's a complex environment, but we've put a 5,700 megawatt plan in place. I kicked it off in April with a 1.1 billion rand budget. We then started adding municipal budgets to it. We're sitting at just short of 7 billion rand that's going in, and it ranges from projects of getting just a lighting pack to matriculants or elderly now. It helps them to study for the exams, to I want to have, burgemeester, een dorp in die Weskaap load shedding free this year. That's a huge order, but let's try and get it done, because if I can get one town load shedding free in this province this year, the hope that builds, and it says, and it gives credibility to the longer term plan of saying we've got enough power in this province. And then, of course, there's a range of projects in between. At the end of the day, the most important thing is it's almost all going to be private sector investment into mini and micro grids across the municipalities, because you've got to bypass the big problems. The big problem we've got at the moment in South Africa, we're not able to generate the sufficient power. We don't have a grid system that even can deal with the current power that's available. There's 8 gigawatts, 8,000 megawatts of power that's available to be put into the system, but there's no trigger being pulled on any of those businesses because the grid is not in place. And we need 14,000 kilometers of grid. At probably our best, we could do maybe 1,000 kilometers a year, but that was at our best. At the moment, we're lucky if we could produce 300 kilometers of grid a year. We need 14,000. It's a problem.
So the solution to that is almost localized and private sector driven.
Correct. Absolutely.
Eskom will not solve our problem. Eskom will just be a player in a whole plethora of solutions.
So in the 5,700 megawatts, it means that we are absolutely resilient, and we probably at that stage would not need an Eskom.
Even for transmission.
We will need it for transmission, and we've also got a wheeling pilot project running at the moment. But I don't ever want to say that we don't want Eskom.
No, Eskom needs to.
Exactly.
Eskom will be part of the solution. It will not be the solution.
Eskom has to be part of the solution. It can't not be part of the solution. But there needs to be alternatives in place. And then what happens is 2 things. One is we, first of all, can then say goodbye to worrying about load shedding. The second thing is, with a multiple sort of different commodity type producers of power coming into the system, and Eskom also being a player, what will happen is that we will actually then have a stabilization of energy pricing. And that's what I'm also after, because energy pricing is critical and a critical component of our competitiveness. And at the moment, with we've got a 30% increase over the next 2 years in energy pricing. That just knocks us out again. So we've got an increase of the very little power that we've got at 30%, and we're still spending all this other money on diesel and alternatives just to even keep in the market. That is a huge risk. That's why financially we're in trouble, and that's why we've got to have this plan to fix it.
Any other questions? Yes. There's a question here, and then from the mayor.
The theme of this nasiengesprek is impact van die Russiese oorlog op handel. There wasn't much spoken about that. Mr. Winder, didn't you go to Ukraine?
No.
Oh, but you had discussions with the ambassador.
I'm meeting the ambassador again tomorrow or Friday. I'm meeting the ambassador again on Friday. But the Ukraine, it's had a massive impact on food inflation, on grain supply around the world. I see some of those supply chains are opening up a little bit now, but it impacted the world on an energy positioning into Europe mainly because of the Russian gas supply. I think it's just Germany's reliance was 17% of their energy supply. But it's interesting to see how quickly, and I keep on saying to the President, their first gasification system to import gas, mainly out of the US, took 192 days to put in place. That was, last year already. And 192 days later, we've done nothing. And those are the differences. They very quickly sorted out their problems. They also have what we would know as load shedding, except they create a space that the citizens turn off their power because they have like 16-fold increase in their energy prices. So then you turn your heater off because you just can't afford to leave it on. And that has massive inflationary impacts globally because that impacts our markets that we're trying to sell our products in, who are now spending all their excess money on energy. And so they have similar issues as an impact of the war. So food inflation and energy costs, just those are the first two.
Wolf, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, we saw, speaking to Premier's point, because of the gas increases, we saw fertilizer prices rise significantly. That is fortunately moderated. It has come down quite a bit. And in terms of the impact on grains, and to your point, the agricultural prices globally, the FAO has noted that the global price has come down, the index has come down by almost 50% compared to last year, March. So we're getting there. We're not back to where we were, but it's stabilizing. And it's not actually a supply problem. We have good crops globally, even with Indians closing markets, rice, etc. It's a supply problem. It's a supply chains problem. Some of it is pricing and risk coming in, uncertainty because of the conflict. That disrupts the markets as well. So it's not a production and a harvest problem that we're facing. But what we are seeing is that the Russians are, unfortunately, very effectively deploying grain as part of the conflict scenario, and they're linking it to fertilizer. There's admittedly a fertilizer gas pipeline that is part of the trade-offs in the negotiations. But it's not that Russian fertilizer exports are sanctioned per se. It's that in terms of the overall sanctions package and some of the individuals who are head of the agricultural conglomerates and some of the agricultural banks that are linked into the international system, it's awkward and cumbersome for them to do some of their trading. But it's not a deal breaker. But of course, in their position, you're seeing a very complicated 3D game of chess between themselves and the Europeans and the Americans, and etc. But I would hope to see further moderation as we're going forward. But a lot, of course, this is a completely black swan event, as they say, and one waits to see what happens with the conflict on the ground and the various parties that are supporting both sides.
And Anthony, just on that point, before we go to the question at the back, financial markets and supply chains have basically discounted this is going to be a long, drawn-out war. Am I right?
Absolutely. I think we have seen input costs fall quite dramatically as the world has got used to the fact that there is enough supply of grain globally. It's just a question of sentiment and logistics. Ukraine is one of the largest exporters of wheat, sunflower, and other products, mainly into emerging and the poorer markets. It's just a question then, because of the COVID situation and the supply chain backlog we have had in the last few years, it's just getting product from point A to point B. So we must never worry we don't have enough food in the world to feed people. There's plenty. It's a question of getting it from point A to point B. And whenever an event occurs which unsettles the market, then the financiers come into play, speculators come into play. And as we saw just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, wheat prices ran 60%, 60%, in a matter of months. Now that quickly translates into higher bread prices, flour prices, which, who does it hit? The underlying poor, who tend to buy the basic, simple starches and products in consumer society. they have now started to come down. We've seen that in the last 3 or 4 months. Input costs have come down. However, to counter that, load shedding. Because I spoke to 2 large bread companies this week, Pioneer Foods and RCL, who are the largest with Sasco and Sunbake. And they are having to heat their ovens, not with electricity, because Eskom is unreliable. You just can't switch a proving oven on and off and a baking oven on and off. They're running many of their ovens now on paraffin, which has just gone up sharply alongside diesel. That cost either has to be borne by the company or passed on to the consumer. And so one of the strange side effects of Ukraine is not just the supply chain disruption of input costs, but the ripple effect of energy exacerbated by us in this country or this government, or the SOEs, shooting itself in both feet. And until we get load shedding actually alleviated, as I was sitting back last week, direct examples, ShopRite, 1.3 billion rand diesel cost this year. Pick and Pay, 860 million rand. Astral Foods, 760 million rand. Libstar, 100 million rand. Even Carp Agri here in the Western Cape, 70 million rand.
And that is the critical element that for us is the biggest risk currently.
Imagine if that money was not being spent on burning diesel to go up smoke, the money you could spend on expanding your underlying business, creating more manufactured capacity, and more importantly, creating jobs, which would lead to taxation. And we are currently spending, I actually don't even know the physical rand value number. It must be tens, if not hundreds of billions that are being squandered in this country, purely because we do not have power in our sockets to run this economy.
At the back, Mr. Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Program Manager. You know, while I'm sitting here, all of us, while we're sitting here, there's a feeling of hope. We must never lose hope. And we all feel that there is still hope for South Africa. But the reality is when we go out there, we're entering, you know, an atmosphere of hopelessness. And what Anthony has said, and also Andrew, I think Anthony has stressed it very much. Business people of South Africa, the most resilient group of people in the world. And Program Director, you said how many times that we know that what Premier Wendy is trying and what he's doing, and his sleeves is always rolled up. But it's not part of the government of the day. But I feel, you know, I just came from Johannesburg last week in the National People's Assembly. And you feel, you know, what is the current situation of all our local municipalities in the country?
Putting me under pressure, yeah.
I had a meeting last night with one of the poorest communities here in Struisbaai and following up this afternoon. My question is, you know, is that while we're sitting here, the Western Cape Premier is not part, we're not part of national government, but I feel that the business people, they should be part of, because this is where the hope lies. If you go out here and you see what is all on the platform here, this is our economy and who's driving it. And our business people should be part every day, every minute of the hope, bringing hope in national government. And I really want to, you know, ask how often, and the Anthonys and the Andrews, are you part of this type of discussions with the president? We know we can look in the mirror what happened around us in South Africa. We've got our neighborhood countries, the people of the neighborhood countries are all in South Africa now. But I'm sure that they all had this type of discussions in the first years when there was still, you know, success in the countries. But do the president listen to you? Do you, you know, go and knock on the doors, and if they don't open, just get a hammer and because you are our future. You should talk to the president like every day. And a lot of things are said here today, and we on local government, as leaders in local government, we have to face the real poverty. People are struggling every day. And while the people who are struggling every day feel sometimes that the farmers are the people who makes money. And we should just turn it around. It's a mindset change. If there's no food, there's no future. And what we've discussed here today is, right at the beginning, politics and economy. Politics is about people. And we should all be driving the economy to secure a future. My question is, I know that the Premier is in conversation every day, every week, every month with the national partners, but business people, do you feel that you have a platform to turn the mindset of the national leadership of South Africa?
Thank you very much. Let me start the question with John. I know that NEDLAC, the financial services sector, Nedbank, the banking sector, do you believe that the message is getting across to the president or to the cabinet or to the powers to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think Ellen, touched on this earlier, is that there's been a great divide for far too long. I would suggest that it is getting closer, and maybe it's been forced upon government and business for that matter. So there are two parties here, and we can't just blame the one. So one would suggest it's out of a crisis, and I suppose the term never waste a good crisis comes to mind, but is that the actual reality is that we have to come together. I do think there is enough discussion. So I participate, for example, in the BASA discussions, which is the Banking Association. And that's our formal mouthpiece, and it then goes into AGBIS and AgriSA, etc., from a business point of view. And that goes into, NEDLAC and so on. So I do think there's formal communication channels. I know that recently there's been a lot of criticism around a business, private business, not standing up enough. And maybe that's fair, and that's probably looking at, the head of Nedbank, the head of ABSA, and the head of RCL, and so on, really standing up and saying what needs to be said. I do see more of that happening as well now. So I think people are realizing that this is critical. So, Mr. Mayor, I certainly don't think it's been that effective historically. I think it has now been heard, and maybe because it's out of desperation. And bearing in mind we are approaching elections in 2024, I think the government is still searching for some good news to put out. So I do think I've certainly seen a greater willingness by both parties to work together. And I know it's not maybe answering the question specifically, but I think we're moving in the right direction. Can more be done? For sure, for sure.
Anthony, your point, your view?
I actually agree. I think we've seen greater leadership coming from the business community in the last few years purely because they've had no choice. If you're trying to run a business to employ thousands of people and you pay your taxes, you need to engage. And having covered the sector now for over 30 years of the JSE, I've seen more willingness in the last 12 to 18 months for CEOs to actually publicly speak out against government and to publish in their annual financial statements or their reports damning commentary regarding the facilities and the services offered by government. And when a CEO of a large company physically has to take a municipality to court to actually provide the water and electricity that they've paid for, which has not been delivered because the money has been purloined, and then they have to go to the president to try and beg him to help. It shouldn't be that way. I think for many years there's been this ideological difference between capitalist business and the ruling party. The trouble is we are now in an existential crisis which needs to come together. We cannot, nearly 30 years after the end of apartheid, still be fighting between capitalism and communism. We should be one united country to grow the underlying prosperity of the entire nation. And I think, quite frankly, if I had my way, I was a child of the Thatcher era in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher, quite frankly, privatized most of the state industries, which were inefficient, bloated, losing money, and were a drag on society. If I had my personal way right now, I would do a PPP or privatize ESCOM as a matter of absolute urgency. Let the private sector who've got the skill and the capital and the ability to raise finance internationally fix our problem, because it is clear that our own government has no will, because they're too busy either protecting their own jobs, their own troughs, or fighting for the election next year.
Can I take that your closing comment?
Yes.
John, closing comment from your side?
Yeah, so maybe a closing comment. If I look back over this period to COVID, to the start of COVID, to where we are now, the level of uncertainty has just been, sky high. But what it has done, I think, is created a positive awareness around our sector. So I think agriculture has actually come through quite well. In those early years, we were expanding, so that was good contribution to the economy. We've spoken about contribution to jobs and so on, to trade, the trade surplus. So, and the whole food security debate. I think if you factor in COVID, you factor in the rights, you factor in the Russia-Ukraine war, the positive sentiment or the space that agriculture is in is far better than it was some years ago. So I think there's a greater appreciation for the value that the sector can add. And I think we need to build on that. And so there's positive sentiment. We need to take that forward. And sure, as private business, we need to back our farmers. And that's what the likes of Nedbank have done. I mean, if you've seen, and I'm part of BASA, and we do submit numbers in terms of funding. So I don't know what ABSA lends, I don't know what I lend, but I know what the total number is. It's quite staggering as to the increase in the lending into the sector over the last 4 or 5 years. It was quite static at about 150 odd billion for some time. I know that shot right up to in excess of 200 billion. Yes, some of that came from Land Bank, but the net lending into the sector was a clear support of the banks in this case, lending into the sector, which I think is positive. Sure, we're sitting with some elevated risk now, but for all of that, I think there's a greater appreciation for the value that agriculture adds to the economy and to society, and that's good.
I want to, Wolf, the topic was of the discussion was around the impact of Russia. Now, Russia is a very small trading partner of South Africa. So that's why it's more the ideology behind positioning ourselves as opposed to a Russia that paints itself in a corner. Your view specifically on Russia is a minutely small part of our trade, but it has this ideological wedge implication between the US and the rest of the world. What should we focus on in this background?
I think we have to focus on where we see ourselves going forward, and part of that is going to need to be generating a shared vision. We have to overcome this ideological belief that you can have a country divided into silos and you survive, a house divided against itself, etc. You cannot have major chunks of society with different perspectives on where you go and who you engage with outside of your box. Our partnership with Russia has a long tail behind it, and in fact so does China's partnership in Africa, much of Africa as well. But so does our partnership with the Europeans, with the English, etc. And I think going forward, there's a lot of commentators talking about what will this war do to Russia itself in terms of change, and where will Russia go. So we mustn't see these things as fixed in stone. We don't know what Russia will look like in 24 months' time. But what we do know is that we are in a situation where global politics and trade relationships are increasingly becoming very fluid, and divisions are breaking down. I mean, you have the Chinese managed to reconcile the Saudis and the Iranians. You have in BRICS Plus these partnerships building that have not occurred before and now make up 1/3 of the global GDP. I think we have to also be nimble and fluid, and also we have to be smart in terms of where we position ourselves. But in terms of Russia itself, I think we have to have a way to respect our traditional partnerships and our relationships, but we have to a way to also respect our needs, our very pressing needs of survival, and those are significantly larger than some of these other needs. As colleagues have said, we have the largest stats, very sadly, globally for poverty and unemployment and etc. like that. And that's those stats have to take precedence over almost any other calculation that we can make. And we cannot throw ourselves as well into a partnership, let's say, with partners that will take just technically 8 to 10 years to fulfill. We must balance that. So we have to nurture our existing friendships, and we have to expand and deepen our new friendships. We must be on all fronts at the same time, but play smart.
I'm going to take you on that.
Okay, thank you.
You say that the problem with does government have the capacity to play the game the complex matrix of weighing elegant politics? Does government have the ability to play that game?
Well, let me give you an example. Vietnam, they are very much ideologically left on the spectrum than us in terms of their government, their approach to governance, human rights, or etc. Or just let's take it in terms of their approach to communism, socialism, and lived policy making. But they lease out their ports, which we have been unable to bring ourselves to do. And they are way more on the spectrum than us in terms of ideology. So because they made the calculation, look, this is not our priority. We will get money from the lease. These guys will build exports and import trade flow. We'll take the rentals from that to the economy and use that to build on the poverty relief.
So it can be done.
Yeah, we have to be nuanced and we have to be smart. If you look at these countries that escaped the so-called middle-income trap, where you get to a certain point of development and then you just drift or you fall back into a lower level. The ones that get it right, the ones that have smart government and the ones that have nimble government, that's what we should be aiming for. And unfortunately, when you insert politics into the mix, politics is always the antithesis of that type of smart government. So there's a place for it, but it has to be something where the parties, the levers within government are balanced. You say, I see your needs, I see my needs as an ideological side.
Alan, I'm going to, this last question or comment from your side. The next time you speak to the president, he says, Mr. Windy, you are flying to the US and to China. Why don't you take control of our Department of Trade and Industry and start to negotiate these things? What will be your priorities, or what will you first of all tell the president?
Jeez, what an amazing question. But I first want to actually answer this question that you've just put and say that the answer to that question is, does our government have that capability? I want to say no, we don't. And so this could
the call might be appropriate.
This could be, no, and this means no as well. I don't think that's going to happen. But yeah, I think politically in that previous question, and I think Vietnam was such an amazing example, because Vietnam is the country that put 9 gigawatts of power using small embedded generation in 1 year into an economy. Okay, they're paying for it over 20 years, but still, 9 gigawatts.
They could put it on.
And the operations of ports. Just those two things are things that if we could get that right in 1 year in our country, we would be a totally different place. And I think that's, to get into your answer, or the answer to your question, it would be those kind of things. We've got to make sure we understand which are the biggest blockages, what are the top 3, and put all of our energy into those top 3 and get them sorted out. So quite frankly, it's energy, it is the ports and Transnet. Those 3 things would change our environment of getting our product to market and getting into the world. Of course, I would try and influence crime somehow through that portfolio as well, because you've got to also reduce crime in our country, and all sorts of crime. Obviously, I would start at murder, but I mean right down to economic crimes. But yeah, that's if I got that position. Sure.
A last word from you, just to close
my
off
last
the
word is
conversation.
I actually would like to use this platform to say, baie dankie landbou. In our province, agriculture is just unbelievable, despite all of these pressures. I mean, we heard that, this last while, we've had the pandemic, we've had expropriation without compensation, then load shedding, the ports, you name the barriers thrown in front of this sector. I don't know if there's any other country in the world where an agricultural sector has that many barriers to get around. And yet, the economic growth in agriculture in the Western Cape now sits at 29%. 29%. It just blows your mind. Now, I've just I'll let you know of a number that's coming out, and it'll be only launched, I think, on the 20th or something like that by our Minister of the Economy. If I think about the projected growth of exports this coming season of another 20%, the loans that have been entered into during this terrible time in agriculture, you just have to drive around this province and see the hectares of netting going up, and I mean, it's just unbelievable. So ek wil net sê baie dankie landbou. The trust in the system, the ability to be innovative, it's just unbelievable. And yeah, it might be a 2.5% primary component, but it's 10% of our economy. It is a major chunk, 20% of our jobs. It is a critical component in this province. So my last word, baie dankie landbou.
Thank you very much. I think let's give him a hand. And then just from my side, I would like to thank the panel. Anthony, thank you very much. Thanks for your comments. I think it was it's certainly passionate plea for the government and the sector to come together. John, as always, thank you very much, and thank you for Nedbank. Thank you very much for coming along. Thank you for supporting it. Wolf, thank you. There's technical aspects. Thank you for dealing with it and making it understandable to the rest of us. And Premier Windy, thank you. All the best. What I would like to say is, the Mayor, people from the department, it is great that we have government involved in the discussions at Nampo Kaap. It would have been magic if we had the local mayors and the premiers involved in the discussion at Nampo Bothaville. But I guess that's the country we're living in. From my point of view, great discussion, great points. I think we talked around the important issues, and I do think that if this is the kind of discussions, and if we can broaden these discussions, agriculture is on a sound footing. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you for the panel, and thank you for everybody for attending. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.